Hi, it's Janet Fitch. It's Writing Wednesday, and today I'm going to be answering questions that have been sent to me this week. And if you have any questions, writing questions, put them in comments, and I'll see if I can answer them. So I had especially questions about foreshadowing this week. People were wondering how do you use foreshadowing, especially in a novel. Hi, Max. And I think foreshadowing is related but not identical with the issue of withholding. They kind of step on each other's toes a little bit, but the distinction between them can be very useful. Hi, Cindy. What's the difference between withholding and foreshadowing? Withholding is where there's a plot twist coming at some point, or the big reveal usually. And the writer purposely doesn't tell us information that naturally comes up as the reader is reading along. There's a situation and where the reader kind of wants a little more information, they notice the absence of information. And this can be foreshadowing. It's often very heavy-handed. I think foreshadowing, the issue of foreshadowing is all about raising interest so that the reader reads more carefully because they're looking for the answer, and it's not necessarily a mystery story. It is often used in mystery because a mysterious, somewhat scary looking character appears and we're wondering who that is, and we'll watch for that character. Certainly the writer's ability to control the readers and direct the reader's curiosity is hugely interesting because, like, we talked about this before, what's the difference between surprise and suspense in fiction? And generally, I think of it as surprise is when something startling happens that you're not prepared for, whereas suspense is when something happens that you were prepared for, but you didn't know how it would play out. So what we're looking when we use foreshadowing is to build suspense, so that the reader's aware that something is going to happen, and we're watching for it. It heightens our attentiveness to the story. And your ability to do this without, some people say never do foreshadowing because it's usually so heavy-handed. But I think the second part of that is the real message, is like how to do it without being heavy-handed, because it increases the reader's pleasure in your book. Hi, Alden. It increases the reader's pleasure in your book to know that something is going to happen or be looking for a clue. Something is so interesting. And I wanted to point out like some of the great examples of good foreshadowing. One of my very favorites is Under the Volcano by Malcolm Lowry. And Malcolm Lowry's Under the Volcano is it works on motifs. So small images, things in the environment, little phrases that not only repeat, but as you see them again, maybe 15 pages later, 20 pages later, kind of raises its head again. Other things stick to it. It's like a motif emerges. It's like an image that's been somehow magnetized, so things stick to it. Near the opening of Under the Volcano, and it's full of motifs, so it's full of underlines. Anybody who's ever seen my copy of Under the Volcano, it looks a lot like that. It's just covered with my notes. There's a mention early on about the town of Oaxaca, and it just says, where's the first mention? So that when you left Yvonne is the wife. This is the story of a man who drinks himself to the death. He's the British consul, and he drinks himself to death on the Day of the Dead in Cuernavaca, Mexico in 1939, the brink of World War II. And he is estranged from his wife, and this is going to play out in the book. So on page 41, we've had an introduction of other characters, like kind of a Shakespearean prologue with Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, that kind of thing. A doctor and another local notable, and they are talking about the consul. And then we actually have the consul enter, and he says, "The day you left Yvonne, I went to Oaxaca. There is no sadder word." And that's it. We don't hear again about Oaxaca. But it's like we know it's the saddest word. It's raised our curiosity. The next time we see Oaxaca mentioned, we're going to be watching for it because he set up a mystery. Why is it the saddest word? And he doesn't answer the question. So he's opened a space of curiosity for the reader. Then, a few pages later, we see Oaxaca is, just, can it be I didn't realize I was still here, or if in Oaxaca. Another just mention of Oaxaca, but it's like, okay, now what the hell? Then a couple of pages later, maybe 10 pages later, well, I actually have been away only once. The consul is talking to his brother, who's trying to get him to stop drinking, and his brother's a communist, a journalist. The consul took a long shuddering drink and then sat down again beside her. Oh, the wife has showed up. Spoiler. To Oaxaca. Remember Oaxaca? Oaxaca? Oaxaca. The word was like a breaking heart, a sudden peal of stifled bells in a gale, the last syllables of one dying of thirst in the desert. Did she remember Oaxaca? And then a little bit, in Oaxaca they had found each other once. And then it goes on for a while more, and we finally get, maybe 40 pages in, Oaxaca meant divorce. It's where they got divorced. So it's not a single reveal, like when you think of withholding and then revelation. It's not a single reveal. That's a motif that builds, and little things start sticking to it, and we start remembering a little more detail, and then finally Oaxaca meant divorce, and it's like, oh. But that's not the end of Oaxaca. It just becomes bigger. And there are hundreds and hundreds of motifs in that book that build. There's a poster of a Peter Lorre horror movie called The Hands of Orlok, but because they're in Mexico, it's Los Manos de Orlok. And Orlok's hands are murderers, but not Orlok. But we see that poster, and we see it again. We see the movie theater where that movie is playing, and something happens to the consul there. So motifs set up an expectation of foreshadowing. I recently read a book that I just adored. It's a book I haven't seen I hadn't heard about. It was just sitting on my shelf, called The Dictionary of Animal Languages. And this is a very subtle book and very controlled of what she tells the reader and what she does not. This is withholding, not that doesn't prevent the generosity. The problem with withholding is often the writer holds that secret of their whatever they're going to be withholding. They hold it so tight that they can't, nothing else comes out because they're sort of in withholding mode. But if there's something that you're going to lay in briefly and then not reveal, the reader has to feel that there's generally a flow of information, that the generosity of the writer is going to fill. You're going to reveal other things. So don't go into withholding mode if you're doing foreshadowing, or if you're withholding certain things. Don't withhold other things. That's why withholding can be problematic, and often I will tell people, just tell it, just give it all, there's more, let the bathwater flow. But there are these techniques that certainly raise the interest of the reader. You can't be heavy-handed with it. In the 19th century, people made their living in publishing in serials. So each week a new part of a Dickens book would be published, and people would go to the docks in America to get that latest installment. So Dickens loved to do some pretty heavy-handed foreshadowing, because he had to keep that reader on the line, and little did he know that on the fortnight, blah, 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 blah. That's what we call the heavy-handed foreshadowing. The more modern approach is to use, maybe think of it more as laying a clue, like this book does a really interesting job. We have an artist who we're following. She was a surrealist, fictional surrealist in the 30s in France, and we follow her present story as she's a 90-year-old woman. And she's a very mysterious person. She has an assistant who finds her very fascinating. And she's always been a mysterious person. So to have a first-person character who is mysterious, she's very controlled about what she will tell the reader and what she doesn't tell the reader. And there was a clue. She has her first friend. She's in the art academy. She's fairly, 18 or 19, and she's never had a friend. She's never confided in anybody. She's very private. So she's talking about children. Her friend is a married woman. I think too much. I enjoy my freedom too much to ever have a child, the friend says, jutting back in the chair. So they're talking about children. The friend is afraid of the violence of childbirth, the loss of autonomy, the love. And that's the thing that terrifies me most. And then internally, the character says, how exacting the knife that skinned off that desire. I say this out loud, though I don't mean to. I share her view, but for different reasons. I have no growing tendency towards domesticity. I can't even remotely imagine the desire to have a child, having only barely escaped my own notion of childhood. But how exacting the knife that skinned off that desire raises our curiosity. What was the knife that skinned off her desire to have children? And indeed, later on in the book, a mystery is laid in. She gets a letter about a granddaughter, she who had never had children. So this is then childhood becomes a motif. Childbearing and motherhood becomes a motif that is a mystery in this book. It raises its head every so often. And it's the most subtle kind of foreshadowing, and it's just beautifully done, that just whenever the issue of motherhood, children, etc., just raises a tiny little specter. It reminds us, oh yeah, that clue, there's a whole thing going on here about that's going here about childhood, about having children, and I don't even know what it is. But it sharpens our view, and we're going to notice it. One of the best uses of landscape is for foreshadowing. It was a dark and stormy night is ridiculously obvious. We've heard that, we've made fun of that one. I'm sure everybody has seen it. But the weather can tell you so much about what to expect. You're setting a mood as foreshadowing. There are a couple of very famous examples of good foreshadowing. This is I want to say this was a Joyce Carol Oates story. Unfortunately, I didn't attribute this. But the raw November afternoon sky moved from south to north over the heads of the two children in a cold and muscular dance of digestion. Well, what kind of a story is that setting up? What is that foreshadowing? I don't sense a story about a cheating bridge game there. I sense something going on over the heads of two children. So I'm waiting to see what that might end up being a symbol of. What is that standing for? The weather is taking on the job of foreshadowing something in a very subtle way. So when you use your weather, when you use the light, when you talk about the senses, you're actually sending a conscious message to the reader of what they might be expecting. So if you don't find yourself using the weather or landscape to foreshadow the themes or what you're going to be working with in your book or your story, you're overlooking an opportunity, because it doesn't have to be a dark and stormy night to be creepy. There's a wonderful line in an Anne Sexton poem. Let's see if I can find it. There's a wonderful line in an Anne Sexton poem, which I believe is about her daughter, and it's a very, aware of the girl's coming of age, and it's called My String Bean. Let's see if I can find it on short notice. My string bean, my lovely one. Let's see if I can find it. Oh, yeah. Let's see if I can find it. I often can't, but I'll tell you what I get, what I remember. It's talking about, usually it's the dark and stormy night, right, to set up a scary mood. But instead, she talks about high noon, that ghost hour, where the world is without shadows. That's spookier to me than a dark and stormy night, because what doesn't have a shadow, of course, is vampires and, scary things that don't have shadows. So the ghost hour of noon. So noon is scary. Oh, here it is. Little girl, my string bean, my lovely woman. 145. Okay, so this is something that you could use to set up something scary in your book. Noon Oh darling, born in that sweet birthday suit, and having owned it and known it for so long, now you must watch high noon enter. Noon, that ghost hour. Oh, that thing without let high noon enter, the hour of the ghosts. Once the Romans believed that noon was the ghost hour. And she's talking about her daughter, coming of, I think, coming into womanhood. Once the Romans believed that noon was the ghost hour, and I can believe it too, under that startling sun. And someday they will come to you, someday, men bare to the waist, young Romans, at noon where they belong, with ladders and hammers, while no one sleeps. Whereas magical night is quiet and magical, that noon is exposure. And that's really interesting. So, you can always use the landscape and use use weather, objects to set up your foreshadowing. Here's another one that I liked. Let's see if I have any examples of that. Other Dostoevsky, where he set Crime and Punishment. When you open Crime and Punishment and begin to understand, as he describes the neighborhood, Raskolnikov lives on a street. There are very few streets that don't open up onto the Neva in Russia. In St. Petersburg. But he lives on one of the streets that does not open up onto the river, and the claustrophobia of the setting sets our foreshadowing, what we're going to expect of that place. And it stinks there, and all the taverns the drunken men encountered at every turn, even though it wasn't a holiday. Setting is super important, and sets a theme. And then you ask yourself, what is this setting up? There's a wonderful, the opening of Bernice Bobs Her Hair. Let's see if I can find that. That really sets up, let's see if I can find it. That really sets up a world where we have somebody looking across a dark golf course to a lit up clubhouse where there's a party going on, and this guy, or whoever our narrator is out, it's like out beyond the fourth tee, across the rolling dark waves of the golf course in the club, and he describes what's going on in the club, and it sets up this separation between the character and the source of light. It's a picture almost of a ocean liner and somebody way out on the sea in the dark looking across to safety, to some rescue. And it sets up this foreshadowing. How is he going to get across that golf course, to this place of safety? Very, very, just such a great use of landscape to set up foreshadowing. I think it's important to do it. I think it's something that has to be done with a lot of delicacy. I usually avoid it, at least in first draft, because I don't know where I'm going. So how can I set up things that I can foreshadow when I don't know what I'm foreshadowing? So what happens is I'll write a big messy draft, and it's very messy because if I don't know where I'm going, I'm exploring different things. I'm laying things in that I might need, kind of like caching tools. You know, you don't know if you're going to need them, so you create these characters, and you don't know if that's character. You know, you meet somebody on the street, you know, or you meet somebody at a party. You don't know that that person might end up being your best friend, or you might never see them again. So it could be either way. So you detail them so that if you do continue with them, they're vivid character in your mind. Then in second draft or third draft, you look at this big mess that you've made, and I call this like raising the Titanic. You look under the surface of the water and you see, oh, there's a ship under there. And you start pulling it up into consciousness. That's where you start to see what you didn't need. So you're cutting out what you didn't need, and then you can start laying in your your clues, your foreshadowing. I had a couple of other questions about foreshadowing. Here we go. Hi everybody. Oh, very cool. Good to see you. There was a question about foreshadowing. You know, generally it's a later draft thing, unless you are an intricate plotter. People who work on mysteries are intricate plotters. So they too have to know what's going to happen before they start laying in clues. So you want to tickle the reader's interest, but you don't want to give away everything, but you don't want to withhold so much that they feel that you feel as a writer that you can't have the generosity with what you are going to tell them. I had I got questions about plotting. How do you write without, how much should you plot? How much time should you spend plotting your novel? And as I've said before, I don't plot, but I am watching for movement in the scenes, the conflict, and how each scene moves the thing forward. So it's like I'm building a bridge from one side, and by the time I get to the other side, I can see that, oh, I didn't need this little angle. But always set your, feel your mood. What is the mood? And use the landscape and use motifs to make that happen. Let's see, how are we doing on time? So that is something that makes that enriches your reader and enriches your story. What else can I say? You can use objective correlatives. Something that's out of place in somebody's house raises curiosity. If it feeds into the theme, if it's a symbol of something, when it raises expectations. Like in Graham Greene's Comedians, set in Haiti, a person goes into the doctor's very Victorian house, but he notices at one point there are these calf-bound books, and then he notices that one of them is Das Kapital, bound like these other Victorian novels. And he realizes, oh my God, there's something political going on here as well. There's a hidden life that gives you the clue for. So I strongly recommend doing it, thinking about it, dropping a hint without paying off. And something that's really important about trusting the reader, this is really a trust issue, is trusting the reader. Now, my teacher, Kate Braverman, used to say, write for the 5 smartest people you know. And sometimes that can, really have you writing for a very small group of people. The idea, however, is, depending how quirky the 5 smartest people are, um, it's not about hanging by your ankles to try to impress those people. It's about trusting the reader, trusting the reader's intelligence, trusting that the reader will pick up the clues. It's something I absolutely hate about a lot of American movies is they don't trust the viewer. They do not trust you to pick up clues. If somebody drops a piece of paper in a rush to leave the room, there will be a close-up of the piece of paper with arrows, and it's just like, oh, brother. Trust your reader, that they will pick up the clues. And then you'll verify that later on. Somebody will read it and, oh, I didn't get that. It's like, oh, well, have to highlight a little bit more. But in foreshadowing, you're better off being very light and then having to maybe come in and sketch a little more heavily than assume that the reader's an idiot. Why are you writing if you're assuming the reader's an idiot? Assume that the reader is keeping up. Everybody has a pretty good idea of, you might want to develop an idea of where your likely reader, have a picture in your mind of somebody that you're writing for, and what would they get and what wouldn't they get. Where do you want to pitch the story? But I think you'd never go wrong by trusting the reader's intelligence. And you have to trust that if you're doing this kind of work. So let's see, anything else? What about setting the opposite mood? Yeah, that's not foreshadowing, but it is, it makes for an interesting, like, daylight noir feel. Graham Greene and his entertainment, Brighton Beach, uses that. There's like a carnival there. But these can be creepy, like Sexton's, High Noon, the Ghost Hour. Let's see, anybody have problems or questions? Let's see. So I have other questions that readers have sent me this week, and a lot of first novel questions came in. So I think people are starting first novels out there. Good for you. What steps should one take to design a novel before setting out to write it? I don't do that. I see something, usually it's a character who is under pressure in their situation, or a character who would be under pressure in any situation. Often I see just a situation, sometimes even starting with a mood, and seeing people and seeing Paint It Black was kind of a gothic situation after a suicide, where it was sort of a persona thing, where somebody has lost their son and their girlfriend kind of becomes the son. So she takes on the persona. And that's all I knew about that book when I started. I wrote a short story, and then it was like, well, how did they get there? Who are these people? And then it starts to expand. That's the way that book came about. White Oleander was a short story. And Marina M. was a minor character who was in exile from after the Russian Revolution. And I started asking myself what happened to her in the revolution? And that's how that. So it's a seed. and then it becomes magnetized and things start sticking to it, and other issues, things that are you're interested in, will start sticking to that. So I would not ever design a novel before I wrote it. But some people are very attracted to form, and they go, oh, I would love to write a novel from 10 points of view. They're attracted to form. They want to play a game with themselves. I want to write a novel about the contents of a French apartment house and tell the story of everyone from the points of view, from the standpoint of enumerating their objects in their apartments. Life of User's Manual. I think, always better to think in terms of a scene rather than a novel. Nobody writes a novel. You sit down and write a scene, and then you write another scene, and you write another scene. And one thing leads to another, or you'll back up. You write the scenes you can see, and then worry about how you get to them some other time. Here's a question. I'm trying to write a novel but cannot think of a single plot. Same question. Write a story if you can't. Don't write a novel. A novel takes years. It's like, oh, I want to have a relationship. Why don't I just marry some random person? No. Write it. Go on a date. Write a short story, and then write another short, and then see what has energy. What seems to open doors inside you. Oh my God, there's more there. There's more. It's just not working as a 10-page short story. Or sometimes you're done. I write shorts, and I think, I'm done. That's what I wanted to say about that situation. Yeah, I could write a novel. I could write a long story about that person. I could write a novel about that person. But really, what I wanted to say about that person is said in 2 pages. That's enough. Just to look at them. Just a glimpse. I want to write a fantasy story, but I don't know the plot. That's then usually a situation will eventually. A plot is what happens when scenes have a change, when the character has a change. Scene, pressure is put on the character, there's conflict, and something happens that the character can't go back to the way they were before. So the next scene will propel the story because they can't go back to the way it was before. And then the next one propels it, and the next one propels it. So you don't have to kind of worry about the plot. The plot is what you will create as you're following that character through the conflicts that are being put on them. My first novel got rejected. Should I rewrite or write a new one? Well, that's a tough one. Everybody who's ever been rejected, how much are you throwing good energy after bad energy, or good money after bad? If you have written a novel and you have workshopped it, other people have seen it, you have rewritten it, and it is rejected, perhaps for reasons that, especially if you can get a reason somehow, does not meet our needs at this time, is really tough. You just pray that somebody will give you an honest answer of why. And then you sit with it. And it's like, well, how does that feel to me? Does that feel right or not? If you have no clue as to why it was rejected, then don't rewrite it. Because a rewrite should be specifically to things that they should be specifically to work on things that need work, that you suddenly get it. You wrote this novel and your agent or your publisher rejected it. That happens to published writers. I mean, we're not even talking about first novelist, although this is a first novel question. you have to ask yourself, is it as good as it possibly can be? And then if you can figure out, that's where you put it away for a while. My first novel, first, I have like 3 or 4 novels that are in the drawer that never happened before White Oleander. And there was one that an agent picked up for me and tried to market and then gave up. Then it just didn't sell. And I put it away and looked at it later, and I figured out what the problem with the book was. But once I'd figured it out, I realized I did not want to rewrite that book, that was just a learning experience, and will let well enough lie. I remember when my daughter was little, she made these joyous drawings. You know how little tiny kids are. They're just another paper there. And then when she was older, like in elementary school, I noticed her like drawing over some of the things that she had painted when she was in kindergarten. Well, I was like, what are you doing? And she said, oh, I'm fixing it. And I had to explain to her, no, this is what you could do when you were 5. Let that be what you were, where you were. And then you do something now. You don't have to fix that. Early novels, maybe you don't have to fix them. Maybe they just were the first pancakes that you needed, especially if you can figure out what was wrong with them. And you have to put them away for a while so you have a fresh look at them. Okay, how do you decide on point of view for your short stories? I'm usually very character oriented, so a short story. I always start with character, so the point of view is pretty obvious. Although sometimes you write the story and you realize that you have the wrong protagonist, which means the character who changes is the protagonist. Like when I started White Oleander, the short story, Ingrid was my protagonist. But people like Ingrid don't change. So there was a story, but she was the wrong person to tell it. There was no protagonist to say. So that's how I decide on, then you're deciding on diction and who are they, so that controls the way they see the world and the kind of language you'll use and that. So there we go. Hey, Linda. So that was a question. Here's another. So my first novel got rejection. Should I write? Depends on how many rejections. One rejection is not a cross sample. It's like people, this disease isn't that bad. I had it and I had their flu and it wasn't that. It's not that bad. A sample of one is not a sample. That is not a scientific study. So one rejection is not something that you should pay any attention to. When you start racking up, like for a short story, you start racking up, 15, 20 rejections. It's like, yeah, there's a problem with that story. A novel, it's the agent rejections. If you have really worked hard on that book, though, and done all the polishing, rewriting, you really feel it's a solid piece. Don't be discouraged by single-digit rejections. Agents are very busy, and you're looking for the one who's really going to love it. Editor rejections, I mean, that's a whole different story, and why, and how that market works, and blah 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 blah. Read the Poets and Writers Complete Guide to Being a Writer. It'll help clarify your point, your perspective on that. Oh, here's a little one. How am I supposed to write my novel while avoiding adverbs? As many authors say they're bad. Okay, there's nothing wrong with adverbs, but usually we don't need them because writers work hard to find strong verbs. You work to maximizing the power of your verbs, and you won't need very many adjectives. Adverbs. The strength of verbs is like the holy grail of writing, because the only thing that can move in a sentence is the verb, the only thing that has action. So always watch that. What should I do if I want to write fiction but have no ideas? Well, you want to write fiction usually because you love reading and you love books and you want to take a stab at it yourself. If you want to write fiction and have no ideas, write shorts, 2 pages, double space. Get a bunch of words as a prompt. And then when you want to write fiction, take a word out of the little thing. Miss is the word. Make a list of the things that miss could mean to you. Is it a little miss? Is it missing the ball? Is it missing you? Who is it missing? And make a list. Make a list of 8 or 10 things that miss could be. And then pick one and write 2 pages, double spaced, using that word somewhere in there. Everything I've ever written has come out of that exercise. Everything. And so you do not have to have something to have no ideas. Ideas, it's what actually comes up out of your own unconscious, especially a prompt where you're not sitting down saying, okay, I'm going to write about a story about courage. It's like, or I'm going to write about that time that Joe did blah, blah, blah. You don't need to. Random is better. You can really come out, surprise yourself. How did I choose third person for Paint It Black? This is a point of view question. I had a character who was very imaginative, very perceptive, had subtle thoughts, but was a high school dropout. And I was going to have a real problem using her diction and vocabulary to explicate the complexity of her mind. So I picked third person so I could use my own language to describe this exceptional person. Shona has a question. I find it hard to turn a short story into a novel. I can't stick with the plot. The short story is usually the starting place, and it doesn't have to be at the beginning. Paint It Black, the short story that I had written that's based on, is really the climax of the book. And then I had to work forward and backward to figure out who everybody was and all that. You never should have to stick with a plot. The plot is what happens as one scene leads to character change and moves the whole narrative ahead. The plot is what ends up happening. It's 1 + 1 + 1 + 1 is your plot. It's like, what is your life? Your life is not what I wanted to happen. The life is what actually did happen. And stories are like that, but they have more cause and effect. Something happens and then propels the character into the next scene. So patience with that. You have to just cope with the fact that you don't know what's going to happen. And you don't know what's going to happen. Here we go. I'm trying to write a book for years, but I can't seem to get past a few pages or develop it, and I rush the story. What can I do to fix this? Okay, when I started writing, I couldn't get a short story to last for more than 3 pages. It's like I wrote what happened, and that's what happened, and I couldn't figure out what else to do. And then I sent it to the New Yorker. um, you have write your little 3 pages and then stop and consider what you've written. Ask questions of what you're seeing. Go to the senses. Where's the light coming from? What's the mood? Give us sounds and smells. Have the character touch things. Have them move between the layers of landscape. Take time there's an exercise that I do to help people kind of break their routine, their grammatical routines. Most people write the same sentence over and over. So there's one exercise that's a 10-minute sentence. And everywhere you would normally put a period, you put a comma and keep going. And what this does is show you what is actually inside a single sentence. When you're writing short sentences and then just putting the period, what happens is like you're trying to get from A to B. Like think of a little deep lake that's not too big on the top, but very deep. And what happens is like you're this little water bug that's trying to take the shortest route from A to B, which is across the surface. But maybe the more interesting route that this 10-minute sentence does for you is breaks that open, and then you start exploring down into the lake and what might be there. So it uses dependent clauses, which means it's sort of like keeping the sentence from ending. So you want once upon a time there was a boy who lived on a hill. Okay, period. Say that's the simple sentence. But when you start putting the dependent clauses in the commas instead of the period, you could say, once upon a time there was a boy who lived on a hill, comma, a hill that was full of rusty cars and smoking buildings, comma, among which lived the colorless Sasquatch, the blah blah blah, the black butterflies of Caldor, comma, where she had come to live after the death of her parents, her father, the bank teller, blah, blah, blah. So you think of ways to keep the sentence going. And what that does is takes your 3-page short story or the 3-page novel that you can't figure out how to extend, and it shows you how much you can unlock in every sentence, how much is still there. It's about considering the implications of what you've just written. You discover a book more than you write it. It's not as much a force, something you force on the page, you impose on the page. It's a dance, and a lot of it is being receptive. It's like being a good lover. It's noticing, it's hearing, it's seeing what's going on and adding to that, or opening another door. That is a way you want to do it. And then what I do is I outline after I've written kind of a mess, and then try to figure out the tones of what's happening. Sometimes I move scenes around. Sometimes I see something, if I have two, say, indoor 2-person scenes back to back, might like an outdoor 1-person scene between, or 2-day scenes, or too many day scenes, one a night scene. You get a feeling for the rhythm of things. I definitely write that way. I have an idea for a novel, but I'm not a very good writer. Do I hire a ghostwriter or attempt to write it myself? There are no ghostwriters for fiction. You know, you have to pull water out of your own well. So try shorts. So here's a thought about, somebody had a thought about the foreshadowing question. Talking about Chekhov's gun, that Chekhov said, getting back to foreshadowing, Chekhov's gun is don't have if you're going to have a gun in the first act, somebody has to shoot it in the third act. That foreshadowing can be symbolic or thematic. And so we're talking about motifs, like Oaxaca, like Los Monos de Orlac, and so on. It's a motif that's tied to the character. I love that kind of foreshadowing. What I don't like is too much. Like, I saw a movie last night that the only flaw in it was that there was a vision of a woman in white floating in the doorway, and there was no other supernatural phenomena. So if you're going to have signs and wonders, you have to they can't just be purposive. They have to be also just in general life, so that when they are purposive, it doesn't stick out like a sore thumb. What else? Any other questions I have? How long does it take me to write 1,000 words of a novel? I can write, 1,000 words, that's like 4 double-spaced pages. I tend to write a whole scene. I don't count words. It doesn't mean anything to me, because I'm not going to write 1,000 words and then another 1,000 words and another 1,000 words, like I'm sewing piecework and piling up the blue jeans that I'm sewing. I think of it more as I take something small, I'll start and get 3 pages into it or something like that, and then it kind of blows up. It's like it was 2-dimensional and then it becomes 3-dimensional. I'm asking these questions. I'm listening to the character. They go on a little bit and I'm going, no, it's going the wrong direction. That's not what I want. I cut that out and try this way. It's developing something that's going to live and walk around and surprise me. So the 1,000-word thing, I think in terms of time more than words. Did I put in 2 hours today? Did I put in 4 hours today? Did I put 6 hours? Did I avoid sitting down? Not as much. So I always like to think time rather than words. The outline. One thing that, if you're writing a novel from a short story and you kind of know where you're going, that this is the sagging middle. That was the question last week. I know where I'm starting. I know where I'm going to end up. What do I do in the middle? And it sort of sags. You keep that tension up. Every scene leads. Every scene has to there's a change that happens in that scene, and the character cannot go back to the way they were before. And that will keep it tight, and it might not end up where you think it's going to end up. Maybe the ending of the short story is only halfway through the story. So you don't know. If you do outline, hold that outline very lightly. And when things start really happening, trust that that's alive, and be willing to let your outline go when you need to. favor what's alive and really growing organically. How much time did it take to write my first novel, start to finish? Well, remember, people's first novels aren't the first published novels. White Oleander took me 5 years to write because I was actually really writing when I wrote that book. I wrote the sentences are really written, not just typed. I really worked on this, and I do. The more I write, the longer I write, the harder writing is, because every sentence has to be beautiful as well as do what it's supposed to do. When I started writing my first novel, the one that I figured out what was wrong with it and abandoned it and didn't rewrite it, or the first novel that didn't even become a first novel because I abandoned it, I'd say that first one took me 2 years to write. And I was just learning. I was learning how to write. White Oleander was 5. Painted Black was, I think, 4. Marina and Chimes together was like 12. And I'm working on something now that's coming pretty quickly. So it's contemporary. I shouldn't say there's no research, but it's research I can do from my desk here. I don't have to fly to Russia. I don't have to comb the stacks of the library to read books from 1924 and then find somebody to translate them or whatever. So the research is to check things that I know pretty well, but I want to get like exact. I'm hoping, and also I'm doing absolutely nothing else but writing. So, who knows? I might actually not write. I might be able to write a book in a year or a year and a half. We'll see. Let's see, one more question, and then we'll call it a day. Let's see. All right. Should I finish a novel I am almost finished writing if I know that it isn't that good? Well, our feelings about our work change over time. Sometimes you're writing and you go, oh my God, this is so good. And then sometimes you're writing and you go, oh my God, this is so bad. And you go up and down, and each draft is like that. And when I finish a book, I generally feel pretty good about it. When it comes back and I get, especially when it's set, when I get it in galleys, I think it's the worst thing I've ever done. I just hate it because I can see it. I can see everything that's wrong with it. I'm a huge finisher. It's to the point maybe it hasn't been all that helpful to me. Mostly it is, but it's also I'm a great believer in finishing. So if your book is almost done and you don't like it, see if you can finish it, if you can figure out how to connect to it long enough that you can finish it. If finishing has been your problem, maybe you have plot problems, maybe you have to raise the Titanic a little bit and see what the hell is this thing about? How should it end? Maybe you're not finishing because you can't figure out how to end it. And by doing the what the hell is this book about can be extremely helpful, because you ask yourself, okay, when character X, your protagonist, finds him or herself in situation Y, which is your general structure, what happens? Okay, I know what my book is about. It is about this character who finds herself in the Russian Revolution, and she realizes X about herself, and she learns it in the hard way. I want to complete, I want a feeling of completion, of satisfaction. I notice, say, that my ending takes me off like at a left turn. It doesn't really resolve or put a final ending on what I have built. So novels are often, you walk through the door that you built, and they go astray when you start and you build a doorway and then you don't go through it. Endings are are the proof of the theorem. They're kind of the sum, the end of the equation. So maybe you're having trouble finding your ending. We all do. We all, I mean, unless you really start with the ending and you know how you want things to end. Often with me, it's just over and over. It's like, no, that's not it. Sometimes you've gone past your ending and really it already ended and you just didn't know how to stop. So keep in your front of your mind, like, what did I want from this? What is the end of the equation? What do they come to understand about themselves? And what's the tone that you want to leave people with? Okay, well, thank you for coming. And I wish you good writing, and I will be here next week for Writing Wednesday. Thank you.